here we are. This is Sex, Love Psychedelics, and I'm your host, Dr. Kat, bringing you psychosexual conversations that will leave you intellectually turned on and hungry for more. There's a trend of microdosing moms, and I really want to pull back the curtain on this and talk about how plant medicines and entheogens can support our women across the stages of pregnancy.
Thank you. So as I'm kind of listening to the musing and understanding what the question is here is, what benefits are we seeing? What is guiding people to even want to ingest these? Why don't people want SSRIs? What harms are possible? What have we actually been seeing in people's lived experiences? What positive benefit are we seeing from mothers birthing people and their children? And why is this information missing? And where is it, if it's anywhere? And so truly, the state of birthing in the West is a very incomplete and cold system that does little to respect the wombs of people. And so what we see in the postpartum period is often the consequence of that extractive process. There's extraction of the earth, there's extraction of the land, there's extraction of resources. And so that same attitude looks at women's and birthing people's bodies and says, like, how can I extract that baby out of you? And that can feel like a very violating experience and not consensual or sensual. There is an unfortunate prevalence of over medication, and that's particular to European and Western women are routinely over medicated, and their births are often like very much overwhelmed by observation, right? Because of cultural narratives, and Black, Indigenous people and women, people of color, tend to be under medicated and under cared for because of pseudoscientific belief systems around pain thresholds and being primitive and things. So the state that a lot of people live in when they come into the birth space is already so deeply augmented by our perceptions of what pregnancy is and how to treat it and if it's a malady or not. And when we're in the birth room, then those systems of extracting the child out of the person's body by whatever means necessary, whether that's to under medicate or over medicate, obstetric violence, things going not as planned, people's rights not being, people's rights not being respected, and also their word and their desires not being respected. And all of that then comes screeching to this incredible halt now that the baby is here, and now we have what to hold us. Now we have what to tell our body that we've done a beautiful thing. Now we have what many hands to help us tend to our homes and help us tend to the world all around us so that we can slow down and rest and be in the cuarentena. There is such a lack in the postpartum care that there is deep sadness and stress. So it's hard to imagine that just adding mushrooms or ketamine to the postpartum experience would fix everything without considering the other many factors which lead to a postpartum experience that feels whole and that feels supported and that feels complete. So I just want to name that entheogens are not some panacea that gets
Hmm.
applied into whatever circumstances possible and eventually will just make everything better by themselves. But instead, like they are part of and belong inside of whole frameworks of restoration and whole frameworks of um, reconciliation and whole systems of reparations for mothers and people who just gave birth.
Hmm.
So, with
So it's
that
really,
said, yeah,
yeah. So it's really taking a look at the systemic trauma that perpetuates this feeling of unsafety in the air around us.
um,
Like the system of, what I mean here is the system of birth, the business of birth.
yeah, that's a great documentary if anyone would like to take a look at that. The Business of Being Born is a really wonderful documentary put together by Ricky Lake, and I feel really like excavates some of these ideas of Western birth. And
Mm-hmm.
I think what's really important parallel here, and the reason I study and create education within mush womb consciousness is that we're watching a very similar changing of hands as we saw in traditional midwifery at the turn of the 20th century, because largely the awareness, understanding, study, and caretaking of birth belong to the hands of lineage midwives and lay people who understand plants and understand bodies by caretaking them for many generations. And as the modernity of Western medicine, wanted to become the main character of all things health and well-being, and birth being a big part of that. The like there was such an incredible campaign to remove the right and the privilege of those people to be able to serve their communities by way of like requiring documentation and licensure and all of these other things in order to practice. And those people were largely written out of the conversation, and the opportunities to support women in giving birth landed largely in the hands of people that didn't know anything about birth. So, we're actually really watching this parallel happen in our entheogenic communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I just want to leave that as a little dog ear, just looking at how folk practices that belong to people um, shift over to belong to industry over time. And that's what the psychedelic renaissance, quote unquote, is like really kind of showing us right now. So, to the point of, the other questions that I laid forward, for example, like the safety stuff and the benefits stuff, and where is the information, and is there any information? When I started practicing and when I started really caring towards the mothers and entheogen space, there was very, very, very little information. We have cultural knowledge and cultural frameworks, and I set my sights to compiling that information, which really birthed the Entheogenic Earth Medicine Assisted Motherhood Guide, which is, yeah, that 52-page document that is essentially kind of pulling all of those tiny threads together into this
Mm-hmm.
tapestry of like, here are all the medicines that we know come from Earth, and here's its relationship to like the female body as a gestational aid and as a support system during birth and postpartum. And weaving what we have in the cultural knowledge with what we have in the scientific knowledge, which is extremely limited.
Mm-hmm.
And that was 3 years ago. And so much has come up from that. Like, I'm so happy to see these organizations come together and this, you know, as much as I dislike the trend of the microdosing mom, I'm happy that it's now becoming more normalized than it's ever been. And that now we can move past the question of, is it safe, into what are the benefits and how are people coming to greater senses of well-being because of their relationships with
Yeah.
entheogenic plants and fungi. So, as much as I just love the trope of the microdosing mom, it was an entryway for so many
Mhm.
people. They
Yeah.
could, the American public could microdose the information that moms were dosing. So now we could potentially move into closer to what the reality is, which is mothers are leaders in the psychedelic field. Mothers are cultivators. Mothers are ceremonialists. Mothers are birthing children with mushrooms in their systems. They have mushrooms in their breast milk, and their children are drinking that. And like it's kind of the rabbit hole that we need people to actually drop into. So I'm glad that the American public could microdose the idea that mothers dose, because now we can have the real conversation, which is how deep does a mother's relationship go? And what is the responsibility that mothers have in the psychedelic space?
Well, that was fun. Thanks for tuning in, lovers. And if you want to experience more ecstasy and sexual liberation, head over to sexlovepsychedelics.com and learn about how you can join me for any one of my online or live events. And while you're there, grab my free guide on sex and psychedelics. Remember, this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Please contact your healthcare provider and local law before pursuing any of the products or psychedelics discussed. And one final note here. I make this show specifically for you. If you're loving the show, then be sure to leave me a review in iTunes or Spotify to let me know. Happy to be here and happy to serve. I'll see you next time on Sex, Love, Psychedelics.